Yeah. So we're just going live. Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today. We are kind of looking forward to an amazing session today. We're just going to talk about how we can build brands faster. And today we have Vinay. Vinay is an awesome guy. But apart from that, he spent a large part of his early career with Unilever building brands, launched his own startup, sold it to Quicker, then kind of decided to don the VC hat. And with Fireside, he's invested in several fairly well known brands already, right? I mean, so Yoga Bar, Boat headphones, and Mama Earth, and then Design Cafe, and things like that. Quite a few well known names out there. And we thought we'll just invite him over and kind of ask him some questions, put him in the spot, do all of that, and take some questions from you folks as well, and quick things on how to ask questions here. Right, if you're joining in, there's a tab called questions, right? So just drop your question there. I'll keep looking at it. I'll try and answer as many as kind of pose as many as I can to Vinay as we move along. And some interesting ones we'll even try and pull up, right? If you're doing something in the D2C consumer brand space, share your startup in the chat, and a one liner about what you're doing. We'll try and see if we can pull you up for a conversation later during the whole session. Yeah, so that's round about it. Vinay, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Ishwar. Strange that it's a good thing that you have a French beard and I don't. Otherwise, we would look like the Roadies twins.
Yeah, I tried to genuinely maintain a slightly more unshaven look today. Hey, so let me kind of start things off, right? I mean, there are a bunch of folks here. A lot of them are building brands, right? But we'll just try and demystify what a brand is itself. I mean, just to kickstart things off, or at least how would you define a brand? Does it change with the digital age, or is it still the same old, right? What do you think?
There are three definitions that I go back to depending on the situation. It's amorphous, and that's why it has three definitions. But an economist's point of view is a brand is a irrational premium that a consumer is willing to pay for a product or a service. Uh, if you were to look at it from a consumer standpoint, it is a brand beyond the product or service that you're consuming leaves you with a feeling that uh, kind of aligns with your worldview, aligns with gives you a feeling of community, and helps you feel safe. And it's a trust marker that helps you. It's short change in your head as a consumer to kind of signal quality, signal consistency in what you're consuming, and gives you a feeling of a community. And otherwise, it is a mishmash of in Unilever speak 6 Ps, which is the right product with a great functional differentiation in the right packaging to deliver great delight to the customer at the point of consumption, at the right price point, with the right proposition, uh, available at the right place where the consumer wants to shop, and promoted in the right manner to create awareness with the consumer. So it depends on how you want to think about it.
I get it, right? I mean, these are some things that one of the words that you used, right? Over there is a trust mechanism. I mean, so how, like, let's say there were ways and means to cause trust in a pre-digital world, right? At some level, you would go to a store, finding a brand there itself kind of signals trust at some level, right? Now when everything is online, right, what are those things that actually signal trust for a customer? And I think how do you signal trust in a digital first world versus I mean, we all come from, let's say, the time when Unilever and ITC and all of that built these packaged goods, and there was like pretty much large distribution plays, large marketing budgets, and things like that, right? All of that has suddenly shrunk, and we're saying that there is an ability for more brands to actually leverage marketing and go direct to customer. But it's now, how do you cause that trust? I mean, I'm a smaller brand, nobody's heard of you, so how do you signal that?
So forget the internet existed. If we have to
Yeah,
look at it from a consumer back perspective,
yeah,
the and there is a brand forward to the consumer perspective, there's a consumer back perspective, but I will always take the consumer back perspective. uh, the way brands could signal trust, irrespective of where you shop. I mean, internet is a go-to market or a media at some level. The first and foremost way to signal trust is, are your friends and family actively recommending it to you or talking about it in a positive manner? If you ask them that, hey, have you tried this brand? Even if they have tried it, do they have positive things to say? Even if they have not tried it, do they have something positive or negative to say about it? If there is positivity in those conversations, that is the biggest signal of trust. That is the gold standard for a brand to have established some kind of trust, right? Take it a step further away, saying, okay, the consumer has not yet consumed it. None of our friends and family know about it. How
yeah,
do I signal trust? Now, what does that consumer, who or what does that consumer trust? So, for example, if you are in the helmets business and the consumer trusts that ISI does a good job of certifying safety, then do you have that trust marker on you? If you are, let's say, in the automobile business, has the Society of Automobile Manufacturers or the ICOTY or any of these large franchises endorse that product, saying, hey, it's a great product, best release this year or whatever it is. So, are there quasi uh, trust markers in your area in which you're building a brand that the consumer already trusts, and can you leverage that trust for yourself? So, for example, if you're trying to build a more sustainable brand, EcoCert or Rainforest Alliance certification will help build that aspect of trust with the consumer. That could be one way of looking at it. That is, what does the consumer trust? Secondly, who does the consumer trust? Because see, we talked about it first up. The first thing the consumer trusts is friends and family. If in the absence of that, it could either be trust markers in the category or it could be people that the consumer trusts. So it could be not friends and family, but influencers. It could be, for example, if you are in the uh, let's say nutrition space, then sports people are known to have good nutrition, and therefore, if they are recommending something, or if they are consuming something, that does have a rub-off effect on the brand. If you are in the, let's say, fashion space, and there are very stylish influencers or very stylish Bollywood actors or sandalwood actors that you really respect for their style, and if they are kind of consuming those products, those brands, then that signifies trust.
got it.
uh,
Some of the examples that you're laying out here, right? I mean, like, let's say getting an influencer on board. Now, let's say if I'm starting off, right? Like I'm launching a brand like tomorrow, right? And I need to get some basic hygiene in place. I mean, like, let's say, what is that minimum hygiene in place that will cause, let's say, if it's a packaged good, right? I mean, let's say if it's a packaged branded good that I want to sell online, right? And there are two routes. Firstly, right? I mean, do I launch on a marketplace? We'll get to that marketplace versus own website later, right? But if I'm taking it online now, how do I ensure that I signal the like I'm launching tomorrow and I don't have the money to sign on an influencer, right? So at some level, so now how do I actually still solve for trust a little bit, at least? How do I get the basics in place? I think that's the question.
Actually, we've seen that 0 to 1 journey a couple of times. So one is bake trust into your product, which basically means that, let's say, if you're a Mamaearth, then you are saying that as a brand, my core proposition is natural toxin-free products, then in your product itself, get your product certified by a third-party lab like Made Safe or anything else that you think is relevant, so that at least forget the influencers, forget everything else. When the customer is sitting with the product in front of her or on her screen, at least there is a trust marker right there in front of her face saying, you don't trust the brand, but there is this body that has already certified this. So try and find some quasi around you that can help you certify. The second one is, I think, influencers. When we talk about influencers, we're not talking about, like a Dia Mirza or, a Malaika Roda on day one. I mean, influencers are people with 2,000 followers. That's a micro influencer or a nano influencer right there. And
Got it.
they don't need too much of capital. They don't need money to endorse a product as long as their worldview aligns with your brand's worldview. If the brand has a purpose or a why of saying for its existence. So, for example, in Mama's case, the what it sells is products for babies and moms, lotions, creams, etc. But the why of what they're doing is of why they exist is to solve first-time parental stress. In increasingly nuclear households, you don't have your mother-in-law or your mother to turn to when your baby is crying in the night. Who do you turn to? And
Got it.
this is a brand saying, okay, I'm going to help solve that stress. Now, here are some products I also sell, but I have a lot of content. I have Alexa skills. You can talk to Alexa and say, hey, my baby's crying in the night. You probably will be hearing Mama's skills talking back to you. So,
Got it.
so as long as the brand's purpose aligns with that influencer or nano influencer's worldview, she
Yeah.
will at least try the product and give an honest review.
Got it. Got
Nothing
it.
else. She's not even going to say that, please buy this product or use my coupon code or whatever it is, but at least she's going to try it and give an honest review. That's all you need to
Actually, it
get
makes
a
a lot of
5
sense,
star.
right? I like the whole micro influencer bit because I think if you reach out to micro influencers or let's say even good names, right? Just saying, hey, this person who is, let's say, a VP at Facebook, right, thinks what these guys are doing is really interesting, right? So if that itself is out there, so sometimes just leveraging network, demonstrating what you're building, and kind of just asking for feedback and saying, hey, if this is interesting, would you just be willing to say this is interesting, right? And sometimes it is a question of having that network. Sometimes there's a lot more hustle involved, right? I think that's what you're saying, but that makes a lot of sense. Biswajit, I hope that also answered your question around influencers. I see that you have asked that question. I'm just moving it to answer. Right. Let me kind of try and get a few things here. Some of the things that you told me about Mama Earth, right? I mean, like, or let's say, a lot of people when they're launching brands, they're obviously trying to launch a better version of something that's out there, right? Uh, there's always this question around better versus different versus what is your theory around around that, I mean, if it has to be better, do you have examples of better versus different versus all of that, I mean, what works in your opinion?
Uh, if I'm understanding the question, Ishwar, what you're asking is, can brands just launch by saying, "Hey, I'm a better biscuit" or "I'm a better
Yeah,
lotion," or do they necessarily need differentiation? Is that the
yeah,
question?
yeah.
Uh, Interesting point. I think every brand needs to occupy a unique space in a consumer's mind. And I mean, essentially, a consumer's mind space is actually 80-90% filled with what's around them, what's happening at work, what's happening with their kids, their parents, their friends, their family. They have very little mind space, and especially in a cluttered world where you're going through a social media feed or you're looking at videos online. You're being bombarded by so many ads. It's very difficult for it to be sticky. And
Yeah,
therefore, if the brand has to have some stickiness in the mind, then it needs to have that differentiated point of view. Now, differentiation has to be at three levels, or at least our world, my worldview is that 2 out of 3 at least, if not 3 out of 3. Now, differentiation happens at 3 levels. One is at the moment of trial, where
Yeah.
you have been bombarding the customer with various awareness campaigns, messages, ads, etc. And when she's finally convinced that, okay, I'm going to try the brand, I'm going to put good money behind it and try the brand. She's never seen the product physically, she's never bought it physically, maybe she's not seen it in a friend's house. She's buying something. So that's first moment of truth. Second moment of truth is actually when the product comes to her house, she opens it and she consumes it. Then there has to be that's the second moment of truth. And the third moment of truth is when she actually finishes consuming it and she's happy to recommend it to people.
Got it.
At least in 2 out of these 3, you need to have a differentiator. If
Got it.
not in 3 out of 3. Great brands have it in 3 out of 3.
Awesome. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So what you're saying is, why am I buying? Then when I buy, if I'm experiencing either, let's say, even the packaging itself, right? At some level, is that clearly differentiated? And
Packaging
post,
and product formulation.
yeah, and post consuming the whole thing, right? I mean, consuming whatever the promise is, whether it's a tech product, whether it's a consumer, whatever the product really is, have they been left with an experience which is different, above what they expected, and therefore referral worthy, right? I think, yeah, it just makes a lot of sense from the way you've structured this. Let me try and ask another question, which I see over here, right? And are these digital first brands purely reliant on one of Facebook, Google, or YouTube for generating, let's say, initial or ongoing traction? Or have you seen examples or plays out there which have managed to escape this? So there are two questions here. Yeah, one is, actually, I'll take it one at a time, but I also wanted to understand Google is good for what, Facebook is good for what, and YouTube is good for what, right? So that would broadly trying to kind of see where the performance is better for what categories, right? I mean, if you have some insight there, that would be awesome.
I'll answer the first question. Ishwar, I think in this connected world, to completely escape Google, Facebook, and within Google, I'm including YouTube in that.
Yeah.
I think it's highly unlikely. I think, yeah, I mean, the other alternate could be marketplaces, right?
Yeah.
Because then you spend money on the marketplace, so you don't need to necessarily be spending money on Google and Facebook. But that's a completely different way of operating. So my sense is it's difficult to escape that. But once you get some critical mass, then actually channel diversification really helps a lot of brands bring down CAC significantly. Even if they get, let's say, 10-15% of their transactions coming through, let's say, direct traffic.
Yeah.
10-15% coming in through, let's say, partnerships, because even other platforms will not want, like an HDFC credit card. Now they have a credit card statement with some nice coupons, etc., for people, their credit card users. A very large base of credit card users, but they will not put you in there till you have a critical mass. But once you get there, that could help you get 10-15% through these partnerships and trade and blah blah blah. Another 10-15% could potentially then start coming from affiliates as well. And therefore, you can diversify your channel mix and significantly bring down CAC. SEO is another one. Again, it's Google, so but they keep changing their search algorithm. But I'm just saying that as you scale and get to a critical mass, those other channels will start coming into play. But in your 0 to 1 journey, when if you're doing D2C and you're just starting out, first 10 orders, first 50 orders, I think it's a bit difficult to escape Facebook and Google. At least I don't have.
I think you're saying critical mass has to be generated there. I actually want to kind of do a little more of a deep dive between advertising on, let's say, Facebook, Google, etc., and you said marketplaces, right? is there a difference between the perception of a consumer on one brand versus another? I mean, when you're advertising on Facebook versus you're advertising on Amazon, or are these deemed as equal forms of advertising at some sense? I mean, is there a difference? One, I'm sure one probably results in transaction a little more easily, right? And I'm wondering if the other results in brand building or a little more affiliation and things like that. So have you seen that from an advertising standpoint?
So again, go back. If we go back to the pre-internet era, if you looked at advertising for new brands, ITC, you said launched, let's say Yippee noodles or something like that, or Sunfeast biscuits.
Yeah, yeah,
Let's say they launched a new variant, or maybe they launched the brand.
yeah.
The first port of call when you launch the new brand will be to dress up the outlets. You'll take those shelves, visibility shelves. You'll have those shelf strips and backing sheets, and your merchandisers going out there and kind of dressing up those outlets, end caps in modern trade, and so on and so forth. So essentially, you are making sure that the point of sale, your brand is shouting quite loudly. So if there is somebody who's already entering the store with a thought to buy biscuits for the family, then you are presenting a best foot forward for your brand at the point of sale. Once when the new brand launch happens, once the distribution happened, point of sale is kind of saturated, then you start doing mass media advertising to drive preference for the brand even before the customer enters the store. So marketplace advertising for us is the equivalent of POS.
Got it.
It is customers who are already there who are interested in buying that category, then you shout a little louder and get some fair share of your those customers. But can you get customers coming to your own website or to Amazon, doesn't matter, with a thought of buying, let's say, a yoga bar, or a predetermined thought of buying, let's say, frog cycles? Now that cannot happen with marketplace advertising. That needs brand advertising. Now the beauty about D2C is you're building your brand along with sales, because there are funnels of acquisition. It's not like you'll just put out some transactional advertising there. You'll see some initial result, but it will peter off very quickly. If you just put transactional advertising saying, hey, here is a new hair cream or a new skin face wash or whatever,
Kind of.
uh, priced at 350 rupees, cross 250.
Yeah.
You'll get some transactions going for sure, but that's going to plateau pretty quickly.
Because you have not yet explained, apart from price, why to buy, right? At some level, I mean,
Absolutely.
the differentiation that you were talking about hasn't been established.
Absolutely. And therefore, when you have to acquire customers on your own D2C website at scale, there need to be funnels at play, where the top of funnel builds awareness, talks to the customer about what are the brand values that appeal to them, the core emotional values, etc. Qualifies the audience, then you retarget those audience with middle funnel properties, which could be unboxing, it could be ingredient story, it could be the science behind why this is better, it could be social proof, it could be XYZ. And
Nice.
then retarget them with price led, discount led, offer led advertising. Maybe it's a remarketing exercise, etc., and then convert. So as you're doing this in the funnel, you are building the brand as well and getting sales out of it. So that's the beauty of D2C, because it significantly kind of unitizes your brand building spend, if I were to put it that way.
So the way I see it is the components of trust in a digital world, right? I mean, when you're advertising, then it becomes what the ad is, right? And how beautifully it says the story. And then when I click through, if I'm okay, my question here will be, now, if people click on an ad and land on your website, how likely are they to complete the transaction on your website versus, let's say, wanting to go to another marketplace? I mean, like, are they comfortable paying on your website for a product? I'm just trying to understand. Or do they only trust Amazon and Flipkart and, and any other marketplace, Myntra, whatever else, right?
No, I mean, see, it depends on who you're targeting. See, I think there's a critical mass of people out there who will transact on websites, right? Now, if you look at the internet map of India, 500 million connected Indians, 150 to 170 million Indians ever transacted on e-commerce. About 40-50 million transacting regularly on e-commerce. I mean, 1 or 2 million out of that 40-50 million is good enough. Are the people who which you will initially target, and definitely are in that bracket who don't mind, converting on your website. As long as the trust markers are given to them. Again, at the on the landing page, you need to have all the assurances saying, we have a 100% refund policy, COD is available. If you don't like it, just send it back, or we'll just refund you. So all of those things, those trust markers need to be there. But I think uh, at a very early stage, if you're trying to just get into the market, and I don't think, I think that problem what you're talking about, right, happens at scale. So when you already have, let's say, 5, 6, 7 million people transacting on your website, and then you want to get the next million in, then that trade-off starts happening, because those kind of tail customers are the guys who are a little skeptical. They're not very savvy. They want to say, okay, fine, I'll check you out. I'll see you there.
Got
Also,
it.
the funnel, out of 100 people that see your advertising, 5 or 6 people at best will click through and come to your website. Then out of those 5, 6, 2% will end up converting. So anyway, the funnel is self-selecting in terms of who converts. So that way you are anyway going to, if you have to optimize the funnel for a good CAC AOV ratio, you're anyway optimizing for people who will end up transacting on your website.
Do you actually see early digital first brands being able to manage this profitably from the get go? Or is it dependent on the ticket size being sold and things like that? I mean, or is this like an invest and reap returns, or is there a way for a small person without too much money to still leverage these channels and make it profitable while using these channels?
So your sense is right, Ishwar. So there are a couple of our portfolio companies when they first started their D2C operations, because they had very high AOV, they had a profitable, make money on the first transaction kind of a situation. Then there are a bunch of other companies who had lower AOVs, 500 to $1,000, who were
Yeah.
still, I mean, if you have a product that's less than 300 rupees, don't sell it on your D2C website, first of all. You'll never make money, right?
Okay.
At least have 700-800 rupees AOV for you to have some visibility of making money. I mean, 100 to 150 rupees taken by the delivery guys. Then you have your cogs to deal with.
Yeah.
You have about 30-35 rupees in a 100 rupee item. So I'm just
Yeah.
saying that ultimately, if you have to have some model of making money, you want to leave about 300-350 rupees per customer as a customer acquisition cost, at least to begin with.
Got it.
Now, within that, we've had some with these low AOV products. We have had very high ROAS brands as well, which are either highly differentiated in their product,
Hmm.
or are attacking a very underserved, smaller niche of the market. It is underserved. Their product might not be like 3-on-3 differentiation, maybe 2-on-3 differentiation, but are serving a customer, a niche customer. It might be 2 million, 3 million audience, but highly underserved. And therefore, the moment you put it out there, you get good ROAS out of it. So either your product is highly differentiated, or you are servicing a niche that is underserved, or you have a high AOV. In which case, you will see money coming in actually on a cash flow positive manner, because you need to pay Google and Facebook only after 45 days. You get
Yeah.
paid on the 7th day, even if it's COD.
I understand what you're saying. Running this on a credit card, is like potentially possible as long as this cycle is profitable, right? So I think so. Very interesting what you're saying. So you're saying as long as you're operating in a niche category where there's one obviously not too much competition because it's a niche, right? And therefore, as soon as you're serving, you're saying I have a product for you itself. There's just so much demand that you're through the roof, right? You don't have to do too much. The demand itself is there, and yeah, just makes a ton of sense. I mean, and of course, average order value being really high, just yeah, that makes it a little easier, right? uh, so I'm going to just try and see. I'm parallelly trying to just check on questions and things like that. Tell me one thing on selling on marketplaces. Uh, is there a strategy that one adopts to ensure that, like, is there a way to leverage a marketplace to cause then more sales from your website? I mean, do you get what I mean? I mean, you have to be present on a marketplace, right? And you don't have an option today because the just of the sheer volume that's going through. But is there a method in which you can leverage that and then shift the future buying to your own uh, website?
Uh, yeah, I mean, is it an LTV kind of question, Ishwar?
So let me state it like this. Like, actually, I'll give you an example. There were these. There was a fashion brand, right? So the fashion brand was first discovered maybe on Myntra, or maybe they're on Instagram and things like that. The first purchase was probably made on Amazon, but they had a much wider range available on their website rather than what was available on the fashion marketplaces, right? So next, if you actually really like the brand, do you see that shift where people who really like the brand, their quality, etc., the next time they just move to their own website to make the purchase, as long as of course price is the same and there's no crazy discounts running somewhere, right? Yeah.
Yeah. No, actually, the marketplaces will force your hand. They will not allow price disparity
Yeah.
between your website and your marketplaces.
Yeah.
The marketplaces have quite draconian laws in terms of any kind of material that you put into your packaging or your communication with the customer, saying that next time please come to our website, because that then takes away the LTV for the marketplace. And if such practices are found with brands, they are very quick to blacklist them and cause all sorts of nuisance for these brands. So one has to be careful when doing these things. But having said that, is there a reason for customers to come back to the website rather than the marketplace if they've made a first purchase in a marketplace? There could be several reasons, right? One is personalization. Can you give a customized offering to the customer on your website? Marketplaces will not allow. So, for example, uh,
But what about they stop you from having a larger range on your own platform? I'm assuming not, right? So as long as product price parity is fine, but range, let's say if I have a greater design range, or I have a larger SKU spread on my own website, right? I mean, it just feels like, let's say, even if I get bought discovered first on a marketplace, as long as I am intelligent enough with my packaging and I'm redirecting people for a larger range on to my website, right? Then eventually you can move a little bit of those transactions, at least future transactions, to your own website.
yeah. Absolutely. I think you can definitely, you're right as a brand to have a larger selection on your own website rather than marketplaces. And in fact, that's part of the innovation model of most brands. So, for example, the way they use the omni channel is their own website is like an online lab where they might have 100 SKUs, let's say, of various products that they're just launching and getting some initial customer feedback. And the beauty about building brands online is that you can do a lot of beta testing before really investing big dollars behind any product. So you can do price sensitivity analysis on your website by split testing pricing. You have two packaging formats or graphics, etc. You can test that, look at conversion rates, and figure out which one is better. Even product formulation, you can have formulation A, formulation B, split test that, look at cohort data, repeat rates, and see which formulation wins with customers. So you can do a lot of experimentation, which is live, and experimentation along with revenue. So it's not like you're doing experimentation in silo on the side and then losing out time and money on revenue. So that's the role of the website. And then out of those 100 SKUs, there'll be some 20, 30 SKUs that meet some graduation standards in terms of velocity, in terms of click throughs, in terms of blah, blah, blah. And then you can take those SKUs and then put them in marketplaces and spend dollars behind them to really grow them on the marketplace. And then maybe there are some graduation metrics on marketplaces, and maybe 4 or 5 SKUs will graduate from that, which you actually then put good working capital behind, and maybe even distribute it offline.
Got it. Yeah, I'm going to try and take a few questions. Vishal, are you around? I kind of want to pull up a startup on stage. He has a brand. He's doing some superfoods, another focused on organic produce directly from farmers. Vishal, are you logging in from a laptop? Then you can raise your hand and just come up on stage. Just unfortunately, I don't think he's on a. He's probably watching this from a mobile device. Let me just see if I can invite him to stage. Yeah.
I'm just trying to see if my camera is working. Just give me a minute.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, there's some problem with the camera right now.
No worries. I think what you can try and share is what your brands are. A little bit about where what kind of traction you are at right now, and any specific question that you have for Vinay, right? Anything that's a problem for you, and we'll try and push him hard to see how we can help you
Sure.
guys through this.
Sure. So thanks a lot, Ishwar. Hi, Vinay. We run a company called Objectivity. We are trying to build purpose-driven brands in the food segment. And unlike most startups, we have actually 3 brands right now. And this is a question that we keep on asking ourselves: should we have or should we not have? But then we have a rationale behind that as well. We've started with the first brand, which is Swabhiman, which is a traceable organic brand. We talk about organic and traceability certificates everyone has, but we are trying to give a traceability to the farmer, to the consumer. So that's sort of tangibility that customers are getting with our brand. The second brand is Berry Nutty, which is a superfood brand, which is a no-nonsense superfood brand, which is having very high-quality dry fruits, which are without sugar, without any added salt. When we are roasting, we are also using rock salt, for example. So we are trying to, create differentiation on that part with this brand. We believe both of these brands target the same customer. But we cannot call dry fruits as organic. Which is a ethical thing that some people using organic brand names for dry fruits as well. But we wanted to go away from it because we know our customer is a well-educated customer who knows that not all organic dry fruits are organic, and in dry fruits it doesn't matter because they are very high quality. While in grains it matters a lot because there are a lot of pesticides that are used. So that is basically the rationale behind this. Now we ourselves are facing this challenge while we have been developing it, and we've been getting some good traction on Amazon. We are ourselves trying to ask ourselves, should we be developing 2 brands, 3 brands? While these seem to be there, we have got early signs of actually people moving from one brand to another brand and buying 2 brands together, even on a platform like Amazon. So any suggestions you can give us on this and give us some thoughts?
Yeah, Vishal, thanks for sharing. I think very interesting spaces. At least my outside in perspective, and obviously you know your customers so much better than I do. But at least my outside in perspective is it's very hard to build a brand because the brand starts even before the customer has opened her laptop or powered up her phone to search for something or is browsing on her social media feed, etc. So a brand is a position that you take in the consumer's mind, and therefore it's very hard to occupy that position. And therefore, building multiple brands together uh, in a capital restricted kind of situation is hard. And therefore, if there is a way to build one brand, get it to critical mass, so that it starts returning free cash flow. Then actually putting that to work in building the second positioning might make a lot of sense. Also, when the positioning of brands is so near to each other, there is Swabhiman, which is traceable organic food, and there's Very Nutty, which is superfood. The only difference is it's not organic, but essentially, in a broader consumer mind, it's all clean label eating in the broader bucket of that, and you want to occupy that position. Then possibly building one brand there, maybe compromising a little on organic, and building something which is more uh, possibly in the uh, clean label space, a position in the clean label space, taking that to a critical mass, and then building another brand in a adjacency rather than in the same space, actually might make for better economics, because then uh, consumers can move from one to the other. I mean, just to give you an example, in our portfolio, Mamaearth built first a brand in the natural personal care space. And once it got to a critical mass, said that, hey, there are a lot of consumers out there who are consuming Mamaearth and love it because it's natural, it's toxin free, it's gentle. But when they have serious skin ailments like an acne breakout or a psoriasis or something like that, then Mamaearth is ineffective because it's gentle. So they need something which is much more hardworking. And that's when he launched a brand called Dermaco, which is again the skincare space, but hardworking as a positioning. So it's an adjacency because it's skincare, same supply chain, but takes a different mind space for the consumer. So possibly that could be a, a more efficient way to do it.
So, Vishal, you've been muted because there was a little bit of background noise, so you'll have to unmute yourself before you speak.
Yeah, sure. Thanks a lot, Vinay. I got your point on how we should go ahead on that. Just a follow up question on this. So when we're talking about developing purpose driven brands, if a purpose is very clear of a brand, will it help us in actually the topic is speeding up the brand building process? So like for example, Swabhiman, the purpose is very clear and very well defined, and we have got actuators which are actually proving with a traceability, with a QR code that the customers can scan. They can actually see the who's the farmer, they can actually know the name of the farmer and photographs. So does it help really to actually build down further on it, invest more, make it even more beautiful, and then try and make sure it is actually coming to the forefront for the customers for faster adoption?
I think in this, we are sitting in 2020, and if a brand doesn't have a purpose, then unfortunately it will not have resonance with a community. I mean, there was a pre-internet era of brand building, which was one to many. The brand spoke to many consumers through mass media like radio, TV, print, etc., and got very little feedback. And therefore, a lot of the feedback got filtered out and was not in public domain. But in today's connected world, if something is wrong with your brand or something the customer doesn't like about your brand, will get shouted and will go into the echo chamber of digital conversations. So unless there is a one unifying purpose which unifies the community around your brand. So even if there is a new customer who has some kind of complaint or question about your brand, the community itself will answer. I mean, the brand needn't even get involved. But that one unifying purpose is required, which then coalesces this community around the brand. Otherwise, it become. I mean, it cannot be the same old formula of, okay, I have a good product, I will shout the loudest and I'll build a brand. It will not work because there will be kind of like erosion of that equity through these smaller communities of purpose-driven consumers.
Got it. Got it. Vishal, I'm just going to kind of take a few more questions here. I hope some of this was helpful. I'll kind of have to get you off stage if that's okay. You want to say
Sure.
anything?
Thanks a lot. I got all my answers. Thanks.
Thanks, Vishal.
Hey, I think Chakradhar here is wants us to revisit that one thing: Google versus Facebook versus YouTube, right? Or let's say text versus images versus video, right? What kind of do you see that a brand should stick to one channel, do that really well? Should they do multiple channels and try to reach customers across each channel? Because a lot of people try to see how can I do something on YouTube, then how can I do something on Facebook, how can I do something on LinkedIn. So they're always trying to do a lot of different channels. What is your take on that?
So, interesting question. I don't think you have a choice. See, the point is, if you're gonna, let's say you as the brand decide that I'm going to just max out YouTube and then we'll figure out the rest of the stuff. Now you make some really interesting creative sequencing on YouTube where you have top of funnel, middle of funnel, you have the retargeting, all of that. Now there is going to be a portion of customers who are going to land up on your website. And 98 or 97 out of the 100 people who land up on your website are not going to make a purchase. That is just how websites work. And therefore, those 97, 98 people will need to be remarketed to. And after spending those good dollars on YouTube to get that traffic, understand something about that traffic in terms of, what video did they last see before coming to my website? What other campaigns have they seen before they came to my website? On my website, what products did they browse? Did they add to cart? Did they, initiate checkout? At what point did they drop off? What other categories did they see on my website? So I've got so much of interesting data rather than another traffic source sitting on YouTube, which you know nothing about. You know a lot about this guy who's dropped off from a website. So you want to remarket to them. Now that person might be sitting on Instagram tomorrow. Why would you want? And remarketing is almost 8x cheaper than new customer acquisition. New customer engagement.
Oh,
So why
awesome.
would you not be efficient about it and remarket to them? Sure, you can say, hey, at the starting point, my core acquisition funnel is going to be Facebook driven or YouTube driven, but your remarketing has to be omni-channel. Now,
This is just sorry, just trying to get the sense of that one statement that you said, where you said remarketing is 8x cheaper. So on all channels. So if I'm just remarketing to the same customer, it's 8x cheaper than a first time advertising.
it's half the CPM, double the CTR, double the conversion rate. So 2 into 2
Okay.
into 8x.
Got it. So eventual end result is that much cheaper. So it may still be not as great from a CPM or a but the click-through rate is much better. Yeah, okay, makes a lot of sense. Got it.
The other way to look at it also, Ishwar, is that let's say again, let's take YouTube as an example, right? Now, Google now allows you to retarget across its properties.
Yeah.
So these are customers who have seen your video
Yeah.
and not clicked and come to your website. So you don't have a cookie on them. You're not remarketing to them.
Yeah.
But you can retarget them on search. So let's say that you are a seller of, what is the brand that Chakradhar asked this question, right?
Yeah. I don't think it was for a brand itself, but I think he
Sure.
just wanted to revisit.
Yeah, sure. Let's say it's a brand like Wow Shampoo. It's not my portfolio, so I can be much more so unbiased about it. So let's say it's Wow Shampoo, right? And they say, okay,
neither of us use shampoo, so we can even talk
also
more.
unbiased opinions that way. Correct. So let's say that they said, okay, I'll have only YouTube as a strategy. Now they put up a great video on YouTube about some the benefits of apple cider in shampoo, etc. The science behind it. Now there are some people who would have watched less than 25% of the video. Some people have watched greater than 75% of the video, but not click through to your website. So you cannot remarket to them. So my first argument is actually gone out of the window. But even those the people who watch more than 75% of the video, why do you want to lose out the opportunity to target them on search? Only those people who watch more than 75% video and then went and searched for shampoos. That's such high intent. And you're leaving that money on the table if you're saying that I'll only do one channel at a time.
Got it. Makes sense.
So I don't need shampoo either. But my question, Vinay, is very different. What I'm trying to do is I'm building a community group of volunteers who will take care of 10 families at a time on their healthcare needs. And so a couple of ways of looking at it. I'm trying to get the government to pay for it, but also the village to pay for it as well. But then also pay per transaction. So you're talking about big numbers. I'm expecting pay per transaction to be about 10 rupees, 20 rupees. So whether they choose to come to me or have a cup of tea, it shouldn't be a hard sell. But then how do I brand this service? So I want to take care of well-being of of people who don't have access to healthcare.
So is it health insurance?
No, it's not. So it's a number of things. One is first take stock of a person's health status. Maybe I would take their vitals. Maybe I would give them point of care diagnostics. Maybe I will refer them to hospitals or clinics or get them a telemedicine service. Those are it's like a resource person for a villager to get access to get a villager access to a good healthcare.
So is the person the key thing? Are you saying, hey, you have this person access, right? For anything to do with health issues.
Right. So
it's like an Anganwadi kind of system.
So I don't know what that is. Sorry. So basically, it's like this. You need a doctor to take care of 1,000 people. That's what WHO says. I think it's a tough call. So instead, what I'm saying is for every 50 people, there is an individual who I'm continuously training to educate and to take care of the health of an individual and in underserved areas.
And I just think that ratio is not going to work. 50 to 1 is not going to work, especially if that's the price point, right? You'll probably have to look at 500 or 5,000 is to 1 to make any form of significant revenue of this. But your thoughts, Vinay? I mean,
I'm a little unclear on the model, but maybe I'll take a stab at it.
Sure.
Chakra, basically, if you have to see, already there are services like Anganwadi, Asha, etc., which are sponsored by the government, which is not primary healthcare but secondary healthcare. They'll also do maternity and all of those basic that infrastructure already exists. So is there a way to use that infrastructure, because the government is very open?
Yeah, I am doing that.
Yeah, they've opened up their infrastructure to private players.
Yeah.
If you have to brand it, I would say then don't try to be everything to everyone. Take a sliver of the market which you think is the most likely to pay for the service or have the ability to pay for the service. Now, my sense is if I've got parents living in the village, I'd love for the service to be available to my parents. And therefore, that could be a demographic or a psychographic that you can go after and say, hey, this is like, I don't know, roots calling or whatever. And it is basically to help. I mean, you can't be there, but here's a service that almost mimics what you would have done if you were around. Because that's a vulnerable segment who needs the healthcare and has a quasi way of ability to pay to the children. So then that becomes a good profitable segment to go after, establish a foothold in the market, and then figure out the next layer of maybe people with disabilities or injuries or something like that as a second cohort. So think of it as segments and not one market.
Okay.
And then take segment by segment and then kind of win each segment rather than otherwise it's very difficult for brands to mean everything to everyone. That's the problem.
Okay. Great. I think that was useful. Yeah. Thanks,
Shankar. Hey, just one probably last brand that I want to kind of pull up, right? Shilpa, are you around? Can you raise your hand? Actually, I'll try and see if I can invite you to stage. I think she's asking a very relevant question, which everybody here will want to know, right? What do you look for at some level in brands? What metrics are you looking for? How do you look at, investability in brands, right? I think that is something that she had posed over there. I'm not sure if she's in a position to join because she may be just seeing this from. Yeah, I think. She has accepted. Maybe she'll join in. Uh,
Okay, long question. I mean, there are several factors that go into it, but maybe I'll try and précis it.
yeah.
Uh, uh, but essentially, uh, counterintuitively, we are looking for niches that the brand can use to enter the market. Because if there's a brand that's launching another shampoo, it's just gonna like be. I mean, maybe I get.
Hey, let me just pause you here. Let Shilpa tell you about her brand, and then maybe you can kind of tell her,
Sure,
what will kind of make it interesting. Yeah.
sure, sure.
Firstly, Ishwar, thanks a ton for doing this. I think this has been extremely useful. Vinay, thank you so very much for sharing all the knowledge that you have. I've been on this from the very beginning when Ishwar started this webinar, and I have been taking copious notes. So thank you very much for that. Okay. Let me just quickly tell you who I am and what we do. I'm the co-founder of a company called Just Amazing Foods and Beverages. Okay. We are the company has been founded by me and my husband. We are 100% plant-based company, which has been around for about 3.5 years now. Okay, we make a range of nut and seed butters, the world's first 30-second almond milk, condensed almond milk. So we've been around for a while, but we're not big enough. Okay, we are in that happy in-between space where funding matters, scale matters. Some people know us, but not enough people know us. It's that midlife sort of stage that we are in. So obviously, for a brand like mine, the questions I would have is around. Some people know me. I do stand for something. People know me for something, and. In our case, people know us as the company that makes a range of plant-based foods which are high on nutrition. Now, my question really comes from 2 points of view. One, we get perceived sometimes, not all the time, as being niche. And in India, niche is not necessarily great beyond a point, how niche is too niche is my question for you. Okay. And the second thing is around, from an, investor point of view, what is it that would matter to you in terms of, what becomes too niche that you say, what, you're cute, you're nice, but, I don't really think I'm the guy for you,
Could you just kind of explain your products again? Because you did say plant-based, but I'm not sure if you got what exactly are the products.
Nut butters, right?
So our current range of products are nut and seed butters. That's where we started the company. We have, of course, over the last couple of months, launched a whole range of new products, including a portable almond milk, which is actually, funnily enough, the first of its kind in the whole world. It's an almond milk which comes in concentrated form, which consumers can reformulate at their own convenience and have almond milk anywhere they go. And it works beautifully well for anybody who's either has a dairy allergy, lactose intolerant, vegans, things like that. And this is one product which has actually done very, very well through the lockdown, because we actually had people calling and saying, listen, every other brand of almond milk that's there, I have to consume in 7 days, and shops are not open or there's no availability, but yours, at least I can stretch it out. So we are plant-based in that sense, and we always will be. We also have peanut flax chutneys. We have roasted nuts and seeds coated with superfoods like flax and chia. We will be launching a whole host of products which are in the dairy-free, soy-free, gluten-free space. Our journey into this is personal. Sorry, I'm piling on to all the people on this call. I'll quickly take 10 seconds to tell you this. Our journey into this is very personal. My husband, Jitin, who's the other co-founder, and I, we both have a son who was born with food allergies. And there was nothing for him in India when he was born, and we were trying to figure out what to feed the child, So we started from a very, very personal point of view, So that's very quickly.
We'll pause here and just try and take his thoughts on this space or anything that you want to say or ask, man. Really,
Firstly, Shilpa, thanks for sharing that, and do give my regards to Jitin. We spoke in 2018 sometime, I'm guessing. Actually, the way we look at it is, it doesn't matter what the entry point of the brand is, and it is better that the brand is entering through a niche, because then the big boys will not be worried about it. There'll be lesser clutter, marketing efficiencies will be better, distribution efficiencies will be better. However, the platform that you're building through that niche that you enter with then should allow you to build a very large play. So, for example, yoga bars comes to mind when we talk about the kind of products that you're talking about, right? Now, when they first launched with their protein and energy bars, Nestle, Britannia, all the big boys were not interested. Though, making an energy bar is no rocket science. I think they had the formulations, they had the capability, but the market wasn't big enough. But because they were left alone to build that franchise out, they were able to build an equity for themselves and a brand platform, an emotional positioning for themselves in the consumer's mind that went far beyond just energy bars. And now they're able to leverage that equity to get into spaces that are much higher time. Let's just put it that way, right? They just have much higher time. They're getting into breakfast, mueslis, they're getting into nut butters as well. So, I think that's interesting for us when we talked about purpose driven brands. What's the purpose? What's the brand platform, the emotional platform that you're building? What's the consumer's mind space or psychographic mind space that you're occupying that makes it rich enough for a decent sized franchise of consumers to be moved by that brand? Therefore, with that in mind, what are the products that you're first launching that will give you that noiseless atmosphere to enter the market? And therefore, what's the next set of products you're launching that will really help you explode the opportunity? I think those are interesting conversations to have.
Yeah.
Got it. Hey, so I think you're saying go niche, but there should be potential for expansion, right? At some level, once you have really captured a consumer's mind in that niche, you want to see the potential for expansion of wallet for that customer at least, right? So therefore, that customer now buys other things under the same range, right, and kind of expands. Makes sense.
Yeah. See, brands 1.0, the way they were built in the olden days was, like Tide. It's just doing whitening laundry, and that's about it. And the way to build a 1,000 crore brand there is you go to 1,000 households, spend $1, and get them to spend $1 with you, and you build a 1,000 crore brand. But in brands 2.0, digital brands, I think the idea is to occupy mind space, get the consumer and the community aligned with your purpose and your brand narrative, and therefore get to the 1,000 crores by going to 10 households and getting them to spend $100 with you. And therefore have that portfolio that allows that cross-sell to happen.
Okay. So you're saying that being too niche is really not a problem as long as there's a future where you can kind of pivot from that niche and get to the next level.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much for that. Pleasure catching up with both of you. Thank you both for your time. I will jump off from here and you can kind of...
I'll just do that. Yeah. Thanks, Shilpa. Hey, we are kind of a little past our closure time, right? So I'm just being conscious of time. Vinay, thanks a lot for everything that you've shared here. I'm sorry. I know there are folks who still have questions and there are folks who would love to come on stage and share what they're building. I'll try and take some time out after this session to see if I can spend some time with you folks on the tables and kind of answer some of those to the best of the abilities that I can. But Vinay, thanks a lot. Thanks a ton for taking time out and just sharing your thought process behind brands. One last question around building brands faster itself. What is the timeline that you're seeing, or rather, like what used to be versus what can be done now? I mean, like how could you? That one last question. Yeah.
You're like taking kind of slides right out of my fundraise pitch deck. So I have a canned answer for that. So look at like new age brands, but slightly older new age brands. Think Viva, think ID Fresh, think Wrong.
Yeah.
These brands, Epigamia,
Yeah.
Paperboat. Now these are all new age brands, but I would call them, the last generation of new age brands. They're the new generation now. And these brands, if you looked at the time frame that it took for them to get to their first 100 crores, it would be about 4 to 5 years. Right. Now you look at new age brands like, let's say, Wow Shampoo, Mama Earth. You look at, let's say, Wakefit. You look at Boat. You look at, let's say, Vadham Tea. Atomberg fans. Some of these are in my portfolio, some are not. These have taken 2 years to get to 100 crores. In a 4-year time frame, they're at 500 crores. Right. So the time frame that is required to get to critical mass is compressing. And that's because more and more people are getting comfortable discovering stuff online and buying stuff online. What happened in the previous generation of brands was discovery happened online, but purchase still happened offline. But here is a set of brands where discovery and closure happen online. And that's also leading to massive capital efficiency, because all that capital that got blocked in working capital by distribution of inventory, now you take all that capital and centralize inventory and deploy that capital back into brand building. That just kind of exponentially kind of moves the virtuous wheel faster.
Yeah, totally makes sense. I mean, if you just don't have to fund all that inventory, then you could actually just build, and kind of potentially work off credit cards as long as a few things match, right? I get that you still need to make a few things.
The elusive product market fit.
Hey, no, fantastic session. I think this has been like shitload that all of us have learned here. Vinay, thanks a lot for taking time out, for spending this time with the folks on Unsolved, right? And any parting words, and otherwise we're good to go.
Anytime, Ishwar, anytime you feel that I can add any kind of value with your community, and thank you everyone for taking the time and spending this time with us. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks a lot. We're going to take a break, folks. I'll try and join you at the table and take a few more questions that I know that we weren't able to take on stage.